Hello, Hughes history students with Mr. Howe. Today we're going to get into a new chapter. We're actually combining chapters. We're going to combine one section from chapter 14 with the rest of chapter 15 and just make that one big unit. So we're approaching the end of our school year. We've got basically 2 units of study to go, and so here's the first lesson, chapter 14, section 4. It's about a very, very important group of people, abolitionists, and especially women who fought for women's rights. So let's go ahead and let's take a look at some of the big ideas as far as goals and objectives in proving behavior. So here are the objectives, proving behavior, and a couple of other big ideas for chapter 14, section 4. The main objective is for the students to be able to demonstrate an understanding of how the spread of democracy led to calls for the freedom for the slaves and for more rights for women. And the people calling for the freedom for slaves called themselves abolitionists because they wanted to abolish slavery. So you see the word abolish in the term abolitionists. The proving behavior is, can you identify the difference between conservative, moderate, and radical abolitionists? Can you identify what Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, Sojourner Truth, and Susan B. Anthony did to try and win more rights for women? Why it matters today. The abolitionists and the women reformers of this time inspired 20th century reformers to continue the fight for equality. So if you're talking about the 20th century, you're talking about people like Dr. King and Rosa Parks and Gloria Steinem, a famous feminist fighting for women's rights, and they're going to be, the continuation, the modern day fighters for equality, and the connection to today. The pursuit for equality continues today as we work to live up to the promise that all Americans have the same rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, as well as equal protection of the law. So at this point, let's go back now and let's take a closer look at some of the big ideas that I'd like you to look for as we go through chapter 14, section 4. So before we get into the actual textbook stuff, the pictures and photographs and primary sources, let's take a closer look at some of the big ideas that I'd like you to be thinking about as you read through this chapter with me. So, to be an abolitionist during this time period was very specific. You wanted to abolish slavery, but not all of the abolitionists had the same ideas. One of the things that we learned about when we were studying chapter 11 is that a lot of students assume that if you were a white Southerner in the South before the end of slavery, you were a slave owner. We know that wasn't true. Only about 25% of the white Southerners in the South owned slaves. And then there's the idea that before the Civil War, if you were African American and lived in the South, you were a slave. And we know that that wasn't true either, because there was a small population of free blacks living in the South as well. Well, we can say the same thing about the abolitionists. Not all abolitionists wanted to abolish slavery in the same way. So we can usually break them up into 3 different groups: conservative abolitionists, moderate abolitionists, and radical abolitionists. Conservative abolitionists would be mostly Northerners who felt that slavery was morally wrong, but were still racist and didn't want African Americans to live in the United States. So a conservative abolitionist idea would be like the American Colonization Society. And they would say, well, let's get a whole bunch of money, let's buy the slaves from all the slave owners, and then send them back to Africa, because we don't want to live among them. So that would be kind of like a conservative abolitionist idea. Still kind of a racist idea, but at least they were, for humane reasons, against the idea of slavery. And there actually was an attempt to do this. There's a country today in Africa that's on the west coast that started off as a colony for slaves to be brought back to Africa. The country today is called Liberia. If you take a look at their flag is very similar to the United States. The name of the country, Liberia, comes from the word liberty, in that the slaves were being given their liberty and sent back to Africa. And the capital of their country of Liberia is Monrovia, named after President Monroe, because he was the president at the time that this American Colonization Society was trying to advance their goals. It ends up not working because most African Americans did not want to go back to Africa, because most of them were not even from Africa. They'd been born inside the United States. They didn't know the African language, the African culture. So going back to Africa really was not the solution that most African Americans had in mind. Then you have the moderate abolitionists. The moderate abolitionists basically were, well, we really can't do anything about slavery where it exists and has existed for hundreds of years, but at least we can stop the spread of slavery. No new states, moderate abolitionists would argue, should be added to the United States allowing slavery. So if slavery is just contained in those original states where it had been for centuries, then perhaps it'll die out in those states as it had died out in the other states. So Abraham Lincoln would be one of those moderate abolitionists. Let's do this legally, let's do it through the process, let's get people elected, and let's just stop the spread of slavery. Those would be moderate abolitionists. And then, of course, you had the radical abolitionists, people like William Lloyd Garrison. We're going to learn about him in a second. Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, that said, be patient. No, this is an emergency. They would use the analogy, if a baby fell into a fire, you wouldn't tell its mother to pull the baby out gradually. You would say, do it now. It's an emergency. Pull that baby out right away. And the same is true for slavery. They would say, this is not something we can be patient for. Slavery needs to end now. If we need to break the laws, let's do it. If we need to hurt people, let's do it. But the radical abolitionists argued that things had to change right away. So in addition to the abolitionist part of this section, chapter 14, section 4, the abolition movement is linked to the fight for women's rights too. Women realized that they would never be able to get equal rights until slavery was ended. You know, many women looked at themselves as, you know, being considered second-class citizens, as free African Americans, and slaves were considered non-citizens as well. So the movements are linked. Elizabeth Cady Stanton is an example of an early fighter for women's rights, one of the founders of the Seneca Falls Convention. Sojourner Truth, an escaped slave who's, you know, besides being anti-slavery and fighting for that movement, the abolitionist movement, also becomes a pioneer when it comes to fighting for equal rights. And then, of course, Susan B. Anthony, probably the most famous one. She's kind of like the next generation after Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Sojourner Truth, but she was, you know, involved early as 19 years of age. She was passing around petitions arguing that, you know, women needed to have the right to vote and things like that. So, but they're all three of these people are very important women. Of course, there's many, many more, but I want you to be thinking about these three specifically. Let's take a look now at the chapter and go through some of the pictures, the photos, and some of the primary sources in chapter 14, section 4. So the chapter 14, section 4 begins on page 440, and hopefully you've already gone through it and read through it. There's right at the very beginning, I don't often make you guys focus on where it says One American Story, but it's a great poem that was written by an African American woman called The Slave Mother back in the 1800s. And just part of the poem says, "They tear him from her circling arms, her last and fond embrace. Oh, nevermore may her sad eyes gaze on his mournful face. No marvel then these bitter shrieks disturb the listening air. She is a mother, and her heart is breaking in despair." In chapter 11, we studied how that one of the sad truths and one of the main ways of discipline that they used on plantations was to sell family members away. And One of the people that we're going to read about, one of the abolitionists, Sojourner Truth, had I think she had over 10 children during her lifetime as a slave, and every one of them was taken from her and sold to somebody else. So it's one of the sad truths about slavery. To be a slave was a terrible thing. To be a female slave was probably worse. When the actual text starts on page 440, it talks about the different abolitionists, and we just saw some that there were different abolitionists. There were conservative, moderate, and radical abolitionists. This one focuses mostly on the radical abolitionists. David Walker was a free African American in Boston who printed pamphlets urging slaves to revolt. So any time that you call for the breaking of laws or violence, then you're considered a radical. David Walker was eventually murdered under very mysterious circumstances, and most people understand that was probably a murder for hire by Southerners to end these pamphlets which were being spread throughout the South calling for the end of slavery. At the top of the next page, 441, it talks about William Lloyd Garrison, who gets a lot of fame for being an abolitionist newspaper writer, famous for his statement at the top of his newspaper that he always printed, I will not excuse, I will not retreat 1 single inch, and I will be heard. So he was one of those people that even though he got beat up a lot, he got pushed around, but in the North we're not talking about Southerners beating up an abolitionist, which you might be able to understand, but this was in the North where he was beat up and pushed around. His printing press was destroyed a couple of times. So these were Northerners who were saying, stop bringing this up. If those Southerners want to have slavery, let them have slavery. We don't have it here, so just leave it alone. So most people in the North were not abolitionists. There's another famous printer named Elijah Lovejoy. I think he was in Illinois. And his printing press was not only destroyed by Northerners, he was murdered by Northerners. So it goes to show you that most Northerners were not abolitionists. There's as much racism in the North as there was in the South. You just didn't have slavery in the North like you did in the South. In this section, it also talks about some Southerners who were abolitionists. Sarah and Angelina Grimke, who were born into a slaveholding family, recognized the inhumanity of slavery and worked in South Carolina to try to end slavery before they were forced to leave under threat of death. And they moved north and became writers and speakers against slavery. Theodore Weld, another one. We talked about in chapter 12, John Quincy Adams, who was a former president that eventually becomes in the House of Representatives. He's going to be one of those political leaders who defies what the Congress wants them to do. Don't talk about slavery, don't bring it up. And he defies that order and reads petitions to end slavery, and was one of the becomes famous as an anti-slavery leader. So in a way, John Quincy Adams does much more as a member of the House of Representatives than he ever did as president. So that's kind of interesting. It talks about, and it has a little inset about America's history makers, Frederick Douglass, and his story is so interesting. Born a slave, it was illegal to teach slaves how to read and write, and slave owners knew that knowledge was power, so they did not want slaves to be taught how to read and write. Well, defying that law in Maryland, the wife of his owner teaches him how to read and write. And he's, just a very intelligent person, very curious person, questions slavery very early in his life, and then eventually escapes. Moves to Massachusetts, gets a job, could have had a great life, just kind of being a regular person, doing his own thing and not being hassled or pursued by anybody, successfully escaped. And then he goes to an anti-slavery meeting that was being sponsored by an abolitionist we already talked about, in William Lloyd Garrison. And during Garrison's speech, he looks out into the crowd and says, is there anybody here that can testify as to what it's like to be a slave? And Frederick Douglass, being an escaped slave, but having a new name and everything, a different name than his slave name, he raises his hand and he gets up and speaks. Well, as the story goes, he speaks so powerfully and with so much passion that people are moved to become supporters of this abolitionist movement. But there's also a small group of people who listen to him speak, and because he spoke so well, said, there's no way that guy was a slave. He's a plant. He was born free, and they're just pretending that he's a slave. So partly to prove his critics wrong, he writes an autobiography of his life, where he tells not only his real name as a slave, he names and identifies his owner, tells the story of how the owner's wife taught him how to read and write. So that places him in jeopardy, because now he can be identified by slave catchers and brought back into slavery. So partly to escape that fact, he has to hop on a ship and go to England, where in England he continues his speech making about abolitionism and being anti-slavery. And in England, people who liked him gave him money so that he could purchase his own freedom. And once he does that, he comes back to the United States and continues his work as an abolitionist leader. One of his most famous speeches, and I know I'm just paraphrasing here, talks about the strangeness of having a system in which one person could own another person. And in his speech, he talks about, do you see this hand? Somebody else owned this hand. Do you see this head? Somebody else owned this head. I did not own my own body. And that becomes one of his most famous speeches that he makes time and time again to convince people about the inhumanity of slavery. So that's a great section to read about America's history makers. On the next page, 442, it talks about something that I mentioned earlier that you might have heard of before in your 5th grade class, because I know a lot of 5th grade elementary school teachers do a really good job of teaching kids about some early American history stuff. And the Underground Railroad is something that a lot of kids have really heard of before in 5th grade. And it does get a lot of misunderstanding. So it's called the Underground Railroad, but it wasn't really a choo-choo train. And it wasn't really under the ground, although there may have been times where people hid underground in a basement or something. But the word underground, of course, just means secret. And by calling it a railroad, that meant it was a transportation system for people to escape the South and to move into the North. And we'll talk about why even in the North it wasn't safe. A lot of escaped slaves tried to move to Canada so that they could escape any type of United States laws. But anyway, so that's the Underground Railroad. They used the terms of the railroad, the hiding places that you were moved to. And the hiding places in the South were basically the homes of free African Americans living in the South. So that was kind of a very dangerous thing to do. If you were a free African American and you were discovered as being a station master, in other words, hiding people during the day on the Underground Railroad, you, of course, would be in for some big trouble. And they had the people who brought them from place to place to hide out were called conductors. And in the next section, it talks about the most famous conductor of the Underground Railroad, Harriet Tubman, and her story is a great story, recently made into a fantastic movie called Harriet. So the idea is that she is kind of like the spokesperson or the main person you should think of when you think about these conductors. But there were hundreds of conductors that did just the same thing as Harriet Tubman. What made Harriet Tubman, I think, a little bit more interesting is that she was a woman, and most women were not conductors on the Underground Railroad. She became so successful at helping people go from station to station and escape the South that there ended up a $5,000 reward for her capture. Today that would be something like $50,000 if you could catch Harriet Tubman. She did it when she was relatively young, but she disguised herself as an older woman when she was in the South. So that's one of the reasons why she was able to escape detection, is the fact that when she was in the South, she would just kind of hobble around on a cane, and she looked like an old woman that, how can this person be a conductor? There's no way. But she wasn't really an old woman at the time. She was disguising herself, and that's how she was able to very successfully lead slaves to freedom in the South. And when we studied chapter 12, and we talked about the fact that Andrew Jackson is going to be taken off the $20 bill, it's eventually going to be Harriet Tubman's portrait, which will be on the new $20 bill. On the next page, which would be page 443, it has kind of like a Reformers Hall of Fame, and it has some famous portraits, paintings, and photographs of some of these important people who were abolitionists and women's rights leaders. So pay attention to that. It shows you a painting of William Lloyd Garrison. It shows you a photograph of Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, photographs of Lucretia Mott and Susan B. Anthony, who we're going to learn about were important in the women's rights movements. And in that section also, it talks about Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Sojourner Truth is also going to be, once again, not only big in the anti-slavery movement, but also in the women's rights movement. So they're important people. And then on the next page, page 444, it talks about probably one of the most important conventions having to do with women's rights, called the Seneca Falls Convention. And right next to that heading, it talks about Elizabeth Cady Stanton and why she felt motivated to be such a believer and supporter of women's rights. At the Seneca Falls Convention, they issue a document, and I wish they had a copy of the document in our book, and I wish I had thought ahead to have one to share with you during this lesson here, but basically they modeled their document on the Declaration of Independence. And instead of saying all men are created equal, their document said all men and women are created equal, that they're entitled to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. So they borrow the form and structure of the Declaration. And if you remember in the Declaration of Independence, it talked about, he has done this, he has done that, talking about King George III, the bad guy in the American Revolution. In their document, they said, he has done this, he has denied us this, he has denied us rights. It's talking about men, basically, that have denied women their rights. So it's a very interesting document, and I challenge you, those of you that maybe have a special interest in learning about some of these female reformers who fought for women's rights, check out the Declaration of Sentiments. They didn't call it the Declaration of Independence. They called it the Declaration of Sentiments. And it's a very interesting document that shows what women were fighting for. In this section of reading, one of the interesting things it brings up is that the right to vote didn't get unanimous approval. There were some women at the time that either believed women shouldn't be voting, or that were worried that arguing for the right to vote would make what they want for other things more difficult. But eventually, the right to suffrage, and suffrage is spelled S-U-F-F-R-A-G-E, not suffrage, S-U-F-F-E-R. Those are two different words. I guess you could suffer if you didn't have suffrage, the right to vote, but the two words are not really connected. But it's interesting that the right to vote, suffrage, was not one of the unanimous things that were unanimously approved at this convention, but eventually, the idea does come through that how are women ever going to get leaders to listen to them if they don't have a say in who these leaders are? It is kind of sad that it took until 1920, just 100 years ago, for women to actually get the universal right to vote in the United States of America. That's not a very long time, 100 years, when you talk about historical things. So, the rest of it goes on and talks about other women, Sojourner Truth, Maria Mitchell, Susan B. Anthony, that accomplished a lot. There's a really wonderful voice from the past about Sojourner Truth, because, like I said, she had the double problem of being an African-American woman. And so there was a lot of discrimination against her because she was an African-American, and a lot of discrimination against her because she was female. And that quote, I'd like to read it to you. "I have heard much about the sexes being equal. I can carry as much as any man and eat as much too if I can get it. I'm as strong as any man. If you have women's rights, give it to her and you will feel better. You will have your own rights and they won't be so much trouble. So some interesting words of wisdom from Sojourner Truth. So the rest of the chapter goes on, talks about how Susan B. Anthony eventually becomes the standard bearer for fighting for women's rights. And then, of course, you have quite a few terms and names to look up, and some main ideas to answer. Hopefully you already did that, some critical thinking. And there's also going to be a chart that I'm going to ask you to add to your notes to get full credit for this assignment. So let's take a look at some of the answers to the terms and names, the main ideas, critical thinking, and add that extra chart about reformers. So now that we've gone through the chapter, you guys have already completed your section assessments and answered those questions, identified those terms and names, and hopefully tried the critical thinking question too. Here are the answers, and as we go through these, would be once again a great time for you to pause and add any details that maybe you didn't have on your paper as you did it. So take a look at the terms and names. Abolition, the movement to end slavery, and it's from that word abolish that they get that word abolition. And if you believed in abolition, you just add the IST on the end, you became an abolitionist. And one of the most famous abolitionists was Frederick Douglass, an escaped slave who became a noted abolitionist leader. And he could really speak to the evils of slavery. We talked about that in the chapter, as he had been a slave who escaped, had to buy his freedom, and became one of the most vocal critics of slavery and of inequality. And for his time, probably the most famous black American of his time. Eventually he does become, as we talked about already, the ambassador to Haiti, the first African American to be an ambassador to another country. Sojourner Truth, another escaped slave. We talked about her already too. Former slave who became an abolitionist and supporter of women's rights. So most of the abolitionists, were also big supporters of women's rights too. They saw the two issues kind of connected. Underground Railroad. This is something you might have learned about in 4th or 5th grade, because I know a lot of elementary school teachers do a really good couple of lessons about the Underground Railroad. And it wasn't really underground. We talked about that. It wasn't really a choo-choo train. It was an above-ground series of escape routes for the runaway slaves from the south to the north that used all those railroad terms. And one of the terms was conductor. We already talked about that. Harriet Tubman is the most famous conductor on the Underground Railroad. Exactly how many people she freed, we'll probably never know. There was a historian that made up that number 300. But there's other historians that went back and looked at the same primary source documents, couldn't really find a number. So most historians today think that 300 number is kind of a made-up number, but could have been about that, could have been more, could have been a little bit less, but that's not the point. The point is that she was a hero for risking her life to try to free other people by going into the South and bringing people to the North. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, one of the early leaders in the abolitionist and women's rights movements, and the next term on there, Seneca Falls Convention, the meeting that she was one of the presidents of that meeting, that convention that called for women's rights. And then there's the term suffrage. And a lot of kids get this term wrong. We mentioned it as we went through the chapter. Suffrage, a lot of people think it has something to do with suffering, S-U-F-F-E-R, but it's totally unrelated to the word suffer. Suffrage means the right to vote. Very good. So then next to that is the chart. Now this is the chart that is the evidence for me that you watched this video and that you actually were paying attention. And so take a few moments right now and copy down this chart. Good place to pause. It talks about reformers here at the top, and it talks about their contributions. And one of the reformers was done for you. We talked about him already, William Lloyd Garrison, a white northerner who published an abolitionist newspaper, supported women's rights. Frederick Douglass, an African American who also published an anti-slavery newspaper called the North Star. We talked about how Originally, Garrison and Douglass were kind of connected, but they had a falling out. So Frederick Douglass actually started publishing his own newspaper called the North Star. We talked about the significance of the North Star already. Sojourner Truth, very important female in the African-American female in the fight against slavery and for women's rights. Harriet Tubman, we kind of talked about her already, another African-American abolitionist who was considered one of the radical ones. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, fought for women's rights. At first she was really more concerned about the rights of slaves and ending slavery, but she found out very quickly that because she was a woman, she wasn't being taken seriously. So she joined with other women to make the abolitionist movement also a movement for women's rights, and was partly responsible for that famous convention called the Seneca Falls Convention, which really gets the publicity that the movement needs and gets the ball rolling to get people thinking about having equal rights for women. So once again, this has to be on your paper to get full credit, so take a moment, pause, and copy down this chart. All right, so now that you've copied down the terms and names or corrected them, copied down the chart, here are the main idea questions and the critical thinking question if you did it. So letter A on the main idea questions was, why were freedom of speech and freedom of the press important to the abolitionist movement? And check your answer and see if it matches with this. The freedom of speech enabled them to speak out against slavery. The freedom of the press enabled the abolitionists to publish newspapers like Frederick Douglass's newspaper called the North Star and William Lloyd Garrison's newspaper called the Liberator. The opponents of the abolitionists knew that they would be generating a lot of information that people were going to read and know about. So that's why destroying newspaper printing presses was very important to the racists in the South who wanted to shut down the abolitionists, because they were bringing up a topic that they didn't want discussed. Even in the North, there's a lot of northern newspaper printers who get their presses destroyed. And we read about Elijah Lovejoy, who was a northerner who was murdered by northerners, because even a lot of northerners didn't want this topic to be brought up, because they saw it as bringing up a problem they didn't want to address. They wanted to ignore it and just kind of let things go on as they always had been. On letter B, what were Frederick Douglass's contributions to the abolitionist movement? And a good answer would be he was an escaped slave and a powerful speaker. We talked about how he had to write that book about his life as a slave and became a fugitive again. And he was also instrumental on helping people through the Underground Railroad. On letter C, it says, what were Elizabeth Cady Stanton's contributions to the women's rights movement? Well, she organized the Seneca Falls Convention that wrote the Declaration of Sentiments. The Declaration of Sentiments declared that all men, and then they inserted, and women are equal. She inspired a new generation of women such as Susan B. Anthony to fight for women's suffrage, which means women's right to vote. And finally, get to the critical thinking question. Why do you think that many of the people who fought for abolition also fought for women's rights? And a good answer would be, well, the two causes had much in common. Both women and black Americans were oppressed groups. Women believed that an end to black slavery and equality for all men would lead to equality for all men and women. Both movements were about gaining freedom and suffrage for oppressed groups. This would be a great time to pause and to copy down anything that you need. So what can we say about the abolitionists and these pretty brave women who fought for women's rights? They actually were kind of a small group of people. A lot of people think when we study this fight against racism and slavery that all the Northerners were abolitionists and wanted to end slavery, and all the Southerners, white Southerners, were slave owners and wanted to keep slavery. We know that's not quite accurate. The abolitionists were actually a small number of Northerners, but they made a lot of noise and they got a lot of attention. Same with the women who fought for women's rights. They were actually a very small number of women who were willing to dedicate their lives to improving the lives of other women. But they were very loud and they got a lot of attention, and it led to a lot of big changes, especially in the 20th century. So that's chapter 14, section 4. Hope you learned something good. Remember to subscribe and ring that bell. Thanks for being here.